Picture a medieval knight. Shining armor, noble horse, off to save the kingdom. Now forget literally all of that, because in real life, most knights smelled like a gym sock left in a sauna for a week. And it gets worse. By the end of this video, you'll know why a tooth infection was scarier to a knight than an actual sword. So today, we're counting up the 7 worst parts of being a knight, starting bad, and climbing all the way to how did anyone survive this? And I do mean 7, because it turns out just fighting wasn't even the hardest part of the job. The paperwork basically was. Stick with us all the way to number 7, because that one is the actual reason most knights made it home at all, and it has nothing to do with fighting well. Number 1, just becoming a knight in the first place. Because it turns out, being a knight was less chosen hero and more very expensive hobby. A full suit of armor, a proper warhorse, weapons, and a squire to help maintain all of it could cost as much as owning a house today. And warhorses weren't just expensive. They were trained almost as rigorously as the knights themselves, taught not to spook, bite, or panic in total chaos. So if a knight lost his horse in battle, there was no insurance claim. There was just a very awkward walk home, and an even more awkward bill. This is also why a lot of knighthoods came attached to land. The income from that land was often the only thing funding all of this in the first place. In other words, before a knight ever swung a sword at an enemy, he'd already been financially wrecked by his own equipment. And unlike a bad Tinder date, you couldn't just walk away from this one. The money was already spent. Number 2, the armor itself. It looks incredible in paintings. It is not incredible to wear. A full suit of steel plate weighed 45 to 60 pounds, and in summer heat, it basically turned into a personal oven with a guy inside it. Knights would overheat and pass out before an enemy even showed up. The armor was doing more damage than the enemy army. And here's the part nobody puts in the movies. There was no bathroom break built into that armor. If a knight needed to go mid-battle, he went. Right there. Chivalry did not cover indoor plumbing. Getting into all that armor wasn't quick either. It took a squire up to an hour just to strap a knight in, piece by piece, in a very specific order. Get that order wrong, and you could genuinely trap or injure the person wearing it. So squires basically memorized a very high-stakes assembly manual. Even the helmet had a problem. The visor restricted vision so badly that some knights fought half-blind, relying on training partners just to shout directions at them. By the time a knight actually reached the battlefield, he'd survived heat stroke, an hour of dressing, at least one undignified bathroom moment, and possibly limited vision. And the fighting hadn't even started. Number 3, the food, or as I like to call it, mystery grain slurry. On campaign, knights mostly ate bread, salted meat, and a porridge called pottage. Basically whatever vegetables hadn't rotted yet, thrown in a pot. Meat spoiled fast with zero refrigeration, so it got buried in salt and spices strong enough to hide the fact that it was, biologically speaking, turning against you. That's actually why medieval cooking used so much pepper and cinnamon. It wasn't fancy taste. It was damage control. Meanwhile, back at the castle, a big feast might feature roasted peacock or swan. Sometimes were dressed in its own feathers afterward for presentation. So yes, nobles occasionally ate a bird wearing its own bird costume. Even the water wasn't always safe, so a lot of people just drank weak ale all day instead, including knights. Before battle. And here's a number that should honestly worry you. Dysentery, extreme food poisoning, killed more medieval soldiers than actual combat did. The real final boss of the battlefield wasn't a rival army. It was a bad sandwich. Number 4, hygiene, or more accurately, the complete absence of it. Bathing happened maybe a few times a year, depending on the season and whether anyone could be bothered to heat the water. Knights wore the same padded gear under their armor for days at a time, which is exactly the environment lice and rashes love. And lice weren't some embarrassing secret. Practically everyone had them. It was less gross exception and more background noise of medieval life. In fact, some surviving letters from the period actually joke about who smelled worse after a long campaign. So at the very least, they were self-aware about it. Some nobles carried small perfumed pouches called pomanders specifically to mask body odor in close quarters, which tells you everything about how big a problem this actually was. So combine heat, sweat, no bathing, and metal armor, and you get a walking biohazard wearing a coat of arms. Number 5. Medicine, or what they thought passed for it. Say a knight actually gets hurt. Here's the treatment plan: wine, prayer, and possibly a hot iron press directly onto the wound. Doctors believe the body ran on 4 humors: blood, phlegm, and 2 kinds of bile, so treatment was really just an attempt to rebalance those. Got a fever? They drain blood out of you, because apparently you had too much enthusiasm in your veins. Leeches were also a deliberate medical tool, and doctors genuinely graded leech quality the same way you judge produce and market. To be fair, some medieval hospitals run by religious orders were actually decent about basics like clean linens, but that standard almost never made it anywhere near an actual battlefield. Infection was the real killer. A tiny cut could turn fatal within a week because antibiotics didn't exist yet. And now, remember that tooth infection thing from the intro? Here it is. Historians believe more knights died from infected teeth than from actual sword wounds. The mouth was completely undefended territory, and honestly, nobody saw that coming. Okay, everything so far has been gross. But numbers 6 and 7 are where it stops being gross and starts being genuinely insane. Number 6, how they trained and what fighting actually looked like, because it is nothing like the movies. Future knights started training around age 7, as pages, learning horseback riding and basic combat before they even hit double digits. By their teens, they became squires, basically knight interns, carrying gear and absorbing years of muscle memory for swordplay and armor management. By the time they reached real combat around age 21, their bodies had adapted to the weight, the heat, and the general suffering. It wasn't strength. It was over a decade of calloused endurance. Tournaments and just were actually one of the only places knights got real full-contact practice between wars, and injuries were common enough that the church occasionally tried to ban the whole thing. And when the actual fighting started, forget the clean one-on-one sword duel. Real medieval battles were chaotic group formations, where staying with your unit mattered more than any individual heroics. Weapons like maces and war hammers were popular for a very specific reason. They could dent armor and injure through it, without ever needing to pierce the metal. A knight's shield arm often took as much punishment as his sword arm, absorbing hit after hit through an entire battle. And fatigue hit fast. Swinging a weapon and 50 pounds of armor for even a few minutes was exhausting, let alone through an entire fight. Before we get to number 7, here's a bonus problem nobody puts in the highlight reel: just staying alive between battles. Most campaigns meant sleeping in a tent, or sometimes just under the open sky. A soaked bedroll didn't care how noble your bloodline was. Winter campaigns swapped one nightmare for another. Instead of heat stroke, now it was frostbite, with metal armor turning painfully cold to the touch. Camps near contaminated water sources could spread disease through an entire army faster than any battle ever could. Sickness didn't care about rank either. And when supply lines failed, which happened more often than you'd think, even the elite knights of the army sometimes just went hungry alongside everyone else. Caring for war horses through all of this also ate up enormous resources, because a sick or starving horse meant a knight fighting on foot, which was far more dangerous. This is actually why a lot of medieval campaigns were timed around the harvest, specifically to avoid the logistical nightmare of fighting a war in winter. So by this point, our knight has survived his own finances, his own armor, his own dinner, his own hygiene, his own doctor, and the weather. And he still hasn't actually won a battle yet. And that brings us to number 7. The actual answer to the question this whole video is built around: how did knights survive? Here's the twist. Most knights who survived a battle didn't win it through skill. They survived because they got captured instead of killed. Enemy knights were worth more alive. Ransom money was a genuine, booming medieval business model. Wealthy or high-ranking knights could get held for months while negotiations played out, essentially becoming a very expensive house guest. So paradoxically, being captured was often the safest possible outcome of an entire battle. Turns out the real survival skill of a medieval knight wasn't swordsmanship. It was being valuable enough to keep breathing. So next time you picture a knight in shining armor, picture him broke from buying his own equipment, sweating, slightly infected, mildly lice-ridden, and hoping someone wants him for ransom instead of a burial. That's the real medieval survival guide. Less glory, more grim logistics. And honestly, knights had it rough, but they weren't even close to the worst era for this. Comment which time period you want me to torture next. Ancient Rome, the Black Death, or Victorian factory life. Subscribe if you want the answer, because apparently humans have never once had it easy.